shore. Now I realize that the treasure are the small fragments of shape and color that have many more stories behind their journey. The toll exacted for these grandiose rewards of existence next to the water can be explained in the horrific newsreels of flooding and storm damage that have become an everyday occurrence somewhere. I grew up, obviously, next to the water. I'm one of those people walking on earth or land, but wishing to be in it, on it, or at the very least staring at it. I'm very fortunate that my parents and my grandparents and their parents were all boat people. I don't know how far it goes back because I was yacht racing when other people might have been exploring their genealogy. But I do come by it naturally. The first time I was shoved under the seat of a sailboat, I was still in a bassinet 63 years ago. As a young girl, the fourth child, well after the other three, I was left to my own devices. And I decided that I wanted to be an artist and a sailor. Neither one is a really good profession for a woman, but nobody cared nor told me. So, and I have that kind of view of the world that has everybody's the same color, and they're just, some are more interesting than others, and everybody is equally as good as the next person. I didn't realize the differences between so many of us, and unfortunately that's become more obvious in recent years. But so I went about being a sailor and an artist and wanting to be good at it, because I was in one of those homes where I was raised to believe I was not worthy. So that, I think, in some cases works to make you better and work harder and jump higher and try and get that approval. So at age 14, I won my first art gold medal from the National Scholastic art magazine that my teacher would put me into shows, and I would bring home critical acclaim as a teenager, which was awesome. And then I started racing sailboats, and I noticed on the other boats out there that there were boats that won, and there were boats that didn't, and there were boats that sometimes won or came in the middle, but there was a varying, discernible level of enjoyment on each of these crews. And the people that won the most seemed to also have the best time, and they didn't have any horror stories. If something went wrong, everybody was fully capable and trained on how to deal with whatever the Mother Nature or the ocean threw at them, or boat breakage or whatever. And so that's where I wanted to be. So that's what I did. I worked very hard to practice and sail and watch and learn and get to know those people that were sailing on the teams that were doing the best. And in 1976, I won my first gold medal sailing. Actually, the only medal of that level of achievement. It was the Women's North American Championships, and it took 5 years to get to that podium, and that was quite an honor. But more importantly, as much as I love sailing and I love getting a boat tuned up and going most efficiently through the water, but the most important thing is to be on the water. The first time I sailed out of sight of land, I was 12 years old, and it was the first time I experienced peace and total happiness and serenity. A lot of people get out of sight of land, and that's not their initial reaction. They were scared, but for me, it was the exact opposite. It was perfection. I grew up in a town that had subsidence issues, and therefore it also had flooding issues. and that comes out in my more recent sea level stories. I call my paintings my sea stories because after a life spent sailing, sometimes inshore, sometimes offshore, sometimes racing, sometimes delivering boats, sometimes just trying to live through it, uh, I have tapped a vessel of stories that seems so far very bountiful, and some days are very calm and peaceful days, and they're the kind of days my mother would like to go sailing on when she was still alive. But I noticed since the onset of COVID, my paintings are tapping into some of the more difficult sea stories, some of the more challenging times at sea. And I was listening to Terenzo, and part of his talk was about, now I can't remember the word he used, but it was basically being a survivor and rising to the occasion. Pardon?
Resilient.
Resilient,
Yeah.
that's the one, thank you. Some days I don't have words. I've been doing a lot of talking the last few weeks, so I seem to be running out. But and in previous talks and telling of the sea stories, I think where I was lost at sea at age 13 with a boat full of people I'd only known a week in Mexico, and then some of my other challenges offshore surviving the situation. People asked about bravery in the audience. They said, man, you must have really been brave. And I think one of the gifts I was given was it just wasn't an option to fail. You just had to rise above and use the wits God gave you and figure out how you were going to survive the situation, whether it was a sinking boat or a broken mast or 80-mile-an-hour winds and 30-foot seas, or an unseasoned crew, in all of those things happening at one time. It was like a good adventure movie where the stars just keep going. They just are, they don't give up. And that, and I think being an artist that creates new things that haven't been done before, which is what my training in California was at Cal Arts, you have to be brave. That's where the bravery comes in. The other offshore, there are times when maybe bravery was a factor, but most of the time it was just digging deep, as my husband and I like to call it, when we're sailing 36 hours at a time, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, steering, taking turns bailing. One of us would be bailing and the other would be steering in the middle of the Gulf Stream out of sight of land, hoping that we were going to see the next daybreak. And we always did. We were delivering a boat for Tread Barta, who had a TV show about hunting and fishing and whatnot, and he was well known. And his boat was kept up at Oatlands in Long Island, and it was a 33-foot Rampage Sportfish, and we had some challenging weather from the Miami Boat Show on up the coast, and we were taking it to Long Island to his marina. But there'd been fog, and there'd been wind, and there'd been all these things. And the boat, of course, was brand new off of the production line, so it too had some intrinsic problems. But we were feeling pretty cush, because a lot of times when we were delivering brand new boats, they didn't have depth sounders or radios or GPS, any kind of electronics we carried in the palm of our hand. And that was in 2004, and as you're well aware, electronics have come a long way in the last 20 years. So anyway, this boat was fitted out, and we thought we were good, and we left Ocean City. We left Norfolk, and then we stopped in New Jersey, and then we were headed to make the last leg, and we got close to New York Harbor, where it has multiple giant shipping lanes. Obviously, it's a mega port. And my husband says, "What course do you have us on? Those are mountains in front of us." I looked at the chart, and I looked at him, and I looked at the sky, and I was like, "No, it's a fog bank." But you never know what you're going to come across. But if you spend your life out there staring at water, staring at the sky, staring at things that you don't understand what they are until you do understand them, all those images are burned in my brain. Before that day was out, we called ahead to see if, once we were in the fog, if Oatlands was socked in with fog too, because it wouldn't be prudent to go into a difficult harbor entrance that we'd never been in before without having visibility. And the girl that answered the phone, bless her heart, was apparently somebody in the kitchen at the resort, and she said, "Oh, it's just raining lightly." Apparently it was a famous Cape nor'easter. But we were back just passing the last shipping lane for New York Harbor and headed due east along the south edge of Long Island. And had we known then what we know now, we would have done things very differently. We would have tucked into New York Harbor and gone Long Island Sound. But instead we were out in the ocean, and it was vicious, and it just was getting more so. And then the low level alarm for the fuel went off, and this boat had been built with extra fuel capacity because of who it was built for, this TV star guy. And so we had calculated how much fuel we should have, but apparently when they installed the fuel tank, they installed the sender and pickup as if it were one of the older, smaller tanks. So we had more fuel, we just couldn't get it. So here we are in a nor'easter trying to go into, we start to go into Mauritius Inlet, and which is the last one before the one we're trying to get in. And we're in these seas, and we're coming in, and all of a sudden I see sand in the breaking water, and I tell my husband, "You have to turn the boat around." And this was back in the days when he and I got to run boats together. Since then I've had to do my share on my own, but I do prefer the challenge when he's there. And he's like, "I can't turn around in this time." Like, "You have to." Here we go. So we survived the turning around. It was kind of one of those the perfect storm kind of pictures, with the big waves and the little boat trying to climb over the big the waves are always worse at the inlet. Once you get back out in the ocean, they're farther apart and they're not quite so dreadful usually. But anyway, and so then we called the Coast Guard and said, "We're shy on fuel," and they said, "Don't go into Mauritius, you'll die." Oh, yeah, we kind of figured that one out. So we continue on, but we're not sure if we have enough fuel. And they said, "If you run out of fuel, you're going to have to throw anchor out, because the Coast Guard will not come out in these conditions." It's the first I'd heard of that, but okay. Anyway, we made it in, and the first thing I asked the guy at the dock after we successfully survived it was where they served shots of tequila, because that just seemed appropriate as a girl from Texas surviving her first nor'easter off the east coast of Long Island. So that brings me to this piece, and this one's called Confused Seas. And the first time I heard that term, I was sailing out in the Gulf of Mexico with my father, and it had been a very difficult night. We had been racing. We had started in Gulfport, Mississippi. We were racing down to Cozumel, or at least that was the goal, on his boat. And I was 19 at the time, so I had some time to let my mortality awareness mature, since the first time I had been lost at sea, or considered lost at sea. So we were in this brutal night, all night, bashing into the waves, and it's daybreak, and I'm on the helm, and everybody else is below. Half the crew is sick, the other half is just trying to pretend they're not. My dad is evil, and he's cooking shad roe in the galley, which is not very nice. There's diesel fuel spilled all over the inside of the boat. The crew is a bunch of people who only 3 of us had ever been offshore before. And this is a 40-foot boat, and we're planning to sail 650 miles across the Gulf of Mexico. And so I'm steering, and it's kind of like riding a bull, I guess, although I've never done that, but a lot of this. And then I am fighting what seems to be more waves coming from different directions, hence the term confused seas. Back in this was 1979, and back in the 70s, they didn't have GPS, they didn't have satellite weather, they didn't have all the fancy electronic communication and plotting and awareness and weather tracking they have now. So one of the clues that there was bad weather coming was confused seas. We had been in some difficult wave action for all night, but all of a sudden there was a whole new set of awful waves coming from yet another direction, which made steering really impossible and an opportunity to stretch my bad vocabulary as a young sailor girl. A lot, loudly. Every time we hit up, out it came. Anyway, after about an hour of that, there was this ding, ding, ding noise, and I'm looking around going, what the heck was that? And it was the rigging on the sailboat. The mast was held up in those days by what they call 1x19 wire, which is 19 strands twisted around and put in a swedge fitting. And even though we owned the best boat store and marine repair facility on the Gulf Coast, my brother had failed to check our swedge fittings for rust. So it was starting to pop out one wire at a time. At which point, because I was terrified of my father, and he's down below cooking shad roe, I'm calling to him, asking him to come up because as captain of the vessel, I need his permission to change course to keep from losing the rig. And he argues with me about it, and I didn't want to yell down what was happening because we had a bunch of people on board that didn't know what that meant, and the worst thing in the world, and the one thing I was taught from this high was don't ever panic. Save that for later. When you're tied up and safe at the dock, then you can crumble. But until then, keep it together. Otherwise, you can't help everybody live. So finally I got him on deck, pointed out the problem. He gave me permission to fall off and ease the sails and to change tacks and take the load off the rig, and then call up the Louisiana Cajun bull rider who'd never been offshore before to come help me fix it, which was basically using hose clamps and chain to sister the mast up in hopes that we could keep it from falling down. And then they said about trying to start the engine. Well, one of the fun things about sailing offshore with my father was you never came home with an engine. It may have worked to get out of the slip to get to the starting line, but once you started that race, you were never going to hear that baby hum again. So, true to form, the Raycor filters, which are what filters out the salt water from the engine, were full of salt water. Emptying them didn't solve the problem. The motor was kaput. We were 24 hours of hard sailing south of Louisiana. We were 125 miles basically south of the entrance to the Mississippi and to Gulfport and anything nearby. And so the best we could do was to luckily the pressure was off the rig at a direction that was sort of headed home back to Texas. So we did that. And as the confused seas gave us insight to, there was more bad weather to come. So we had been in 35 to 50 mile an hour winds all night, all the day before and all night. And then we started having these seas come from different directions. And by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we had everybody on the crew but my father and I locked below in the cabin with everything dog shut. We had every line and spare item we could dragging behind us to slow us down. We had all the sail down we could possibly have down. The anemometer that measures the wind blew off at 80 miles an hour. And the seas got about the size they did in that Perfect Storm movie. As much as some people thought that was fake, when I saw it, I went straight into the fetal position. Anyway, my father and I kind of bent over, kissed our asses goodbye, and held on for dear life, and we came out on the other side and survived it. And then like any good, really bad storm, on the other side of it, there's no wind at all. They had used the last of the battery power to call the race committee to tell them we weren't going to finish the race because we had problems, and that we were going to try and head back to land. We didn't really specify where that was, and because the engine didn't start once that battery was dead, we had no radio, so pretty much nobody heard from us for 7 days. That one little couple hour period that second afternoon was the only time where I was really concerned. The rest of it was just 7 days at sea with a bunch of men that smelled like diesel, and no lights. And we actually did sail by some oil rigs in the Gulf where there were men working that we were trying to yell at and give them our information so they could tell our family we were still alive, but apparently they didn't bother. So when we sailed in a week later to home at Seabrook, Texas, my mother and my first husband both looked at us like we were ghosts. It was not expected. So that was the second time I was written up lost at sea. But all these memories fuel my paintings because I have those. And it's not a terror fear. I feel like there's still beauty in my abstract seascapes because I have survived all these things. And there's a not just a relief, but a feeling of success at overcoming that level of adversity. And whether you're on land or at sea, whatever you're at the mercy of, whether it's mean people or Mother Nature, to get to the other side of that is truly a rewarding situation and has its own manifest beauty, I think, is the way I look at it. So one of the things about Seabrook, Texas, where I started was because they were pumping oil, gas, and water out from underneath the land, it was subsiding a foot a year. For the 12 years I was aware of it. And it was also in between Houston and Galveston, and it just happened to be placed such that if it rained on the north end of Houston, all the bayous would run through our town. So didn't even have to rain in Seabrook for it to be flooded. And this was back in the 60s and 70s when it wasn't the catchphrase sea level rise or, permanent flooding or inundation and those kind of things like it is now. But it's part of what inspired my sea level stories. And back home I have about 20 more mannequins in all different sizes. 7 of them are dedicated to the Chesapeake Bay area because I was contacted by people in Annapolis to please do a big uh, uh, private, well, public showing, uh, solo show at the Annapolis Maritime Museum from July to December of this year, and then also the assistant to the Maryland Department of Environment wants to, for at least their lobby while the other show is up, to help bring awareness to what's happening. In their case, their land is subsiding as well as the Gulf Stream slows down. It typically would take a turn right by the Chesapeake Bay would be here, and the Gulf Stream would pull water away from that shoreline because it's such a fierce body of water. And it's like sailing a sailboat and having that sailboat get onto a fast moving train when you're delivering boats north. It's quite a thing to behold, and it's even more of a thing to try and get out of it, to turn left to go wherever, whether you're going to Charleston or North Carolina or wherever. If you don't make the turn in time, you're going to miss your port, because it's a very powerful body of water. Anyway, because it's not taking as much water away from the Chesapeake, and the Chesapeake is, land masses are sinking a bit, and whatever's happening with sea level rise, they want to bring attention to it with the sea level stories. And another 10 to 15 are going to go to the Keys for the month of October, and then travel back up the Keys and stop at some of the schools to bring awareness and make an emotional connection to the peril that they are facing. And that's actually being funded by people involved in the insurance business and the banking business down there, because they want to get people they want to help their residents shore up their properties from the effects of storms, and hopefully save as many rooftops and whatnot as they can. So, any questions?
Wow.
There's many more sea stories. If you hear me talking and you enjoyed it, there will be another talk someday. Yes?
I was not here for the whole, I stepped out for a moment. Did you tell the story about when you were young and you were sailing around
Long Island?
Yeah.
The
Did
last
tell
one
us
you
that?
heard? No, I didn't. So we started out with a very quick timeline of when things I did art and sailing related, and the first two, the gold medal sailing in 1974. But before all that, when I was 9, my parents traded me for the summer with my aunt and uncle's son. They swapped. So my cousin went to live with my parents, and I went to live with them. And the first day I was there, my uncle took me sailing on a wooden sailboat, and the mast broke. And he was that kind of, how the hell he lived to be 95, nobody knows. Because he would take off on his sunfish and sail 20 miles down a river, having no idea how he was going to get back. In his 70s, he did that and fell off the boat, and luckily some good Samaritan came and saved him. But anyway, okay, so here I am. The first day is a broken mast experience. Then he goes off within the next day or two to go race big boats. They are living in Fairfield, Connecticut on Long Island. I've never been there before. I'm 9 years old. I certainly haven't studied a chart. I barely sailed on board boats a little bit, luckily enough to be able to go upwind and downwind, and I understand that part. But I think it's a cool idea. He's going to go race on these big boats out of somewhere. I'm guessing it was Stamford. I don't know, really. But I take off, and I kind of ask him, if I were to leave the beach, which way would I turn to find you? And I said, right or left, and not even port or starboard. And he tells me. So I go launch this little 14-foot sailfish that doesn't even have a cockpit. I don't have lunch. I don't have a jacket. I don't have any idea of where I'm leaving from. I don't notice that on my way to find him and the big boats, I'm sailing over all the rocky groins, which are later in the story exposed because I was apparently going there at high tide, and at low tide it meant I had to go all the way farther out into the middle of Long Island to avoid all those groins. So I sail and I sail and I sail, and God knows I don't have any idea what time of day it was, but it was after 12 when I got there and found them, and they were circling to start their big boat race. And I'm sure my uncle, being who he was just thrilled to see me, not having any more thought than the 9-year-old how in the hell she's going to get back. But so that's how it went. And so they went off, and so I went to sail back. At least I was smart enough not to follow them. Oh my gosh. But the day wore on, and then it was getting dark, and I'm still having to avoid the groins because they're all exposed and there's little lights on them, and then it gets dark, and I'm hungry, I'm cold, I'm lost, and I'm just sailing along going, well, I'm gonna get in big trouble if I take this boat back to a beach that's not where it came from. I am more concerned about that. Yeah. That's the way my life was. So, what will the grown-ups do to me? Not, am I going to live through this? Does anybody care? So, I sail along to what is probably about 9 o'clock at night, 9:30. And finally, I'm just like, okay, it's been picking up wind-wise. It's getting a little scary. If I tip over out here, nobody's gonna find me. I don't know what else is going on. I don't have running lights. You know, this is just not a good situation. So I'll round the next groin, and I'll sail to the beach, and I'll pull the boat up as far as I can, and then I'll go knock on a door and say, hi, I'm 9 years old and I'm lost. And hopefully nobody will be too mad at me for too long, because otherwise that would make for a very long summer. So I do, and I'm sailing between the last groin and the next groin and toward the beach. And all of a sudden I see there's a lot of people. I see flashlights, and oh my gosh, is that a policeman? And sure enough, it was the right beach. And there was my aunt and my uncle, and I'm sure that they were breathing a sigh of relief that they didn't have to call my mother and father and tell them that I was lost. But like I said in the previous stories, that would have been the first time, but not the last time.
Wow.
So it's been a wonderful life of adventure. It continues. I'm very lucky to be a licensed boat captain. Since 2016, the boats I've delivered are all multi-million-dollar yachts for Palm Beach yachts and Grand Banks yachts, and that's a fun adventure. But I am spending more time in the studio these days painting about it than I am doing it. But my husband's a yacht broker, so I'm expecting him to call me any minute and say, I need you to come help me. So anyway,
Awesome.
thank you all.
Thank you.